Hello, good morning or good afternoon from wherever you're tuning in from today, and welcome to the final Automotive Logistics live stream of the year, where we'll be wrapping up all of the key events, impacts, and lessons of 2025, all in the next hour. It's very ambitious, I know. But I'm Emily Wemedemo, Managing Editor at Automotive Logistics, and I'll be your host today. It's great to have you with us as we wrap up and what it has been a truly big, impactful year. 2025 has really kept us on our toes. Supply chains were tested by everything from capacity crunches and port congestion to new regulations and shifting trade dynamics. But through it all, we still saw incredible resilience and innovation in response. So over the next hour, we'll look at some of those challenges and, more importantly, share what we've seen, some of those big key lessons navigating these disruptions. But before we dive in, here's a brief look at today's agenda. We cover 5 pillar topics here at Automotive Logistics, but we've really seen 3 of those themes come very to the forefront in the past year. That's localization, digitalization, and the EV transition. And that's all been underpinned by an overarching focus on resilience. So during today's show, I'll share some highlights from our conferences and interviews, and we'll bring in video clips so you can hear directly from some of the key industry voices as well. After that, we'll have 2 live discussions, first with Martin Corner from Aston Martin, a supply chain leader who has navigated major changes this year. And then we have our very own Christopher Ludwig, our Chief Content Officer, to help us wrap up some of the bigger lessons of 2025. So it's definitely a packed agenda. So I'm going to dive straight into it and start with the first theme of localization. So after many disruptions in recent years, from geopolitical tensions to natural disasters and even COVID, which feels almost 5 years ago now, but I think it is 5 years ago, is companies in 2025 put more focus than ever on localizing their supply chains to improve resilience. And of course, recent tariffs and trade barriers push companies to take a much harder look at their sourcing footprints, especially if they were relying on single source suppliers. Many OEMs started considering, dual sourcing critical components from different regions or helping key suppliers set up operations closer to their plants. But with all of those changes, they do take time. You can't duplicate tooling or qualify a new supplier just overnight. So in the meantime, localization efforts have all been around coordination and planning in real time. On the outbound side, that has meant not just reconsidering where vehicles are built or where parts come from, but even redesigning logistics networks to shorten supply lines and reduce risk. And simply assembling vehicles locally doesn't make a supply chain resilient overnight. True resilience really comes from localizing the wider supply chain base and the surrounding logistics flows, which is a complex multi-year journey that involves resetting supplier footprints, trade routes, and even port of entry. It also requires recognizing that long-standing practices, many like regional, looking at critical minerals in one area is no longer really making sense. We saw that especially with the chip supply crisis, with recent events involving Nexperia. This kind of transformation also often demands far closer collaboration between logistics and procurement teams, because sourcing strategy ultimately shapes how logistics networks are built. So whether it is Liberation Day with the cherry, which may have been the cherry on top for an industry exhausted from crisis firefighting, or if it was the tariff flare-ups at borders, ships getting stuck at ports, or just sudden custom changes that finally pushed things over the edge, the response this year was an industry pushing back by diversifying supplier footprints and building more regional buffers. Many companies set up new control towers to monitor cross-border flows in real time. They hired trade compliance experts to navigate the tsunami of new regulations. Some even decided to carry a bit more inventory on hand despite that extra expense, because the cost of missing parts and became higher than ever. And we had this point being reinforced by a new goal. The Volkswagen Group of America's Executive Vice President of After Sales and Services, in a Red Sofa interview in September, he said the cost of redundancy today is less than the cost of reacting after the fact in a level of uncertainty. So now this push for regional resilience is happening globally. It even came up as a core theme at our ASEAN conference in October, but it's arguably been more visible in North America and Europe, in part due to this year's geopolitical events. And I won't bore you with every twist and turn in the tariff saga. We've just shared a tariff timeline in the chat so you can stay up to date on some of the movements happening there. But yet, despite all the political noise this year, most OEMs didn't suddenly uproot factories or abandon global platforms. Instead, they're definitely doubling down on visibility and agility, finding ways to keep product moving across borders, but with careful planning. So as the news shared with us in September, rather than halting everything or rushing to localize manufacturing overnight, Volkswagen really focused on using data and regional integration to ride out the storm. He emphasized that uncertainty is still there, but VW has very much learned to live with it and building more flexibility, urgency, and backup into the supply chain, very much leaning into the uncertainty. So let's take a quick look now at how he described this shift in mindset.
I'd like to understand what the impact has been or how you're feeling it on the parts and service side in terms of the tariff implementation. What does it mean in the context of your supplier footprint and your service?
Well, one, thank you for asking about parts and service, right? It's, for most OEs, arguably one of the most profitable elements of the business that people tend to forget about, right behind financial services or right, in some cases above financial services. The simple answer is tariffs add cost. You have to decide as a company what your priority is. We have decided that continuing to provide service parts is priority number one. And we can get into a whole discussion about bad things that happen if
I'm sorry about the technical difficulties there, but the clip will be shared with you in the chat now. So I do really encourage you to watch the full interview later. But I can give you some context. What you could have seen there was really Anu talking about localizing certain service parts like non-safety commodity parts to reduce the dependency on imports and cut tariff costs. It's definitely a pragmatic approach for sure. Pick the low-hanging fruit, as it were, for local sourcing was definitely feasible in the short term, but also he's very realistic that you can't localize everything overnight or even just in a year. So I do really encourage you to watch the full interview. There is a part 1 and a part 2 there. And he even notes that sometimes the answer to trade disruption isn't to abandon globalization, but rather to better connect your supply chain. And he shares more of those details and how VW is really doing that in the interview. But now localization really isn't just about avoiding the trade wars either. It's really about speed to market as well. We're seeing companies are reconfiguring their networks to shorten lead times and stay closer to the customer. And we're staying within the Volkswagen family. For an example here, the company made a notable move this year in Europe by opening a new vehicle handling port in Venice, Italy. It's part of a strategy to shift some export flows away from Northern Europe towards the south, closer to markets like the Eastern Mediterranean and even Asia, and to build resilience by creating more routing options. And back in April, on our finished vehicle logistics live stream, turning trade changes into network games, Peter Hernlein, Volkswagen Group's managing director of vehicle logistics, shared some of these key lessons with us on the Venice project. So I'm hoping to share a clip of that with you now.
Peter, for you and your perspective, what have been some of the major lessons learned from this year, from the ongoing challenges that we face and discussed at length here, and how will they shape VW's future vehicle logistics strategies and network designs?
Yeah. So what was really a key learning is, but I think it's not only this year, but that learning started a couple of years ago already. Once you have a setup, you cannot take it for granted that it will be in a stable mode with predictable volumes, with predictable market demands. So I think when you create a structure, create a network, you have to build in a lot more flexibility and the need to react and adapt to changing circumstances. So these changes in flexibility upwards, but also downwards, we are basically reflecting in the concepts. We are also discussing with our partners and building in the contracts. And for sure, you also need backup solutions. So if one element of the network or one element struggles, you need to be able to move either from rail to road or from road to rail to switch from one port to the other. And these things need to be considered. And the Port of Venice, what we discussed, is a prime example to build in so-called resilience. If we have a struggle in the northern port, we can also allocate other volumes to the south or vice versa. And for sure, also a big lessons learned is that you need to exchange information in a quite frequent, in a transparent way with all of the partners within the automotive supply chain. And we have also created a tool, our so-called outbound order book, which really helps us to communicate using communication standards, sharing information quite transparently and frequently. And we are also having high frequent meetings with our key service providers and strategic partners to really reflect what's the tendency, what's the developments we see, and how can we adapt to it.
Fantastic. So one of my biggest takeaways from that FEL live stream was Peter's point that you can't assume your network will stay stable. OEMs have to constantly build in that flexibility into their supply chain. And a resilient network is not just about the ports either. Peter mentioned they're constantly reviewing a mix of transport modes too. If rail capacity tightens, they can shift more volume onto trucks and vice versa. But critically underpinning all of this flexibility is better information sharing. Volkswagen created a digital outbound order book tool to give all of its logistics partners a real-time shared view of vehicle orders and movements. And by communicating frequently and transparently, VW and its carriers can really anticipate that volume swings or delays and adapt together. So it's really that kind of end-to-end visibility, essentially an integrated outbound control tower is quickly becoming a must-have for resilience across the industry. And VW really isn't alone here. There's signs of the vehicle logistics sector moving towards a more regional, multi-node network instead of relying on just a few giant hubs for entry. We also saw a new port terminal capacity open this year in the Riviera, and that project was by RS Altman. So I also just want to note here, because we have been exploring some of those themes around flexibility, visibility, and vehicle distribution optimization, that we will be covering these topics in a lot more detail at our Finished Vehicle Logistics North America 2026 conference in April. If you're interested, please do go ahead and scan the QR code on your screens now, or visit the Automotive Logistics website for more details. We would definitely love to see you there. Now, I just want to shift gears slightly, stepping back to consider the broader landscape of resilience planning in periods of immense change. And to do that, I'd like to bring in the perspective of a luxury automaker, Aston Martin, whose low volume production depends on a highly complex supply chain, rich in bespoke options and custom materials, and therefore inherently fragile. And back in March, we spoke with Martin Corner, Aston Martin's head of supply chain and logistics, who shared why one of his top priorities this year year was to improve planning and coordination to prevent crises before they happened. He had just introduced a formal S&OP process at the company for the first time. It definitely represented a significant cultural shift within the company, moving from a largely reactive boutique style of decision making to a more disciplined, data-driven operating model that aligns sales, production, and supply chain. And here's just a small segment of Martin sharing that with us.
Side of things, there were decisions being made by the CEO at the time directly with the chief commercial officer, and of course that was creating big fluctuations. And sometimes I guess the company was being curveballed by, if you have certain stock building in certain markets and you're not tracking that, then you end up doing a huge correction rather than a adaptive rolling correction on a monthly basis to balance supply and demand. So we focused a lot in the first year or so on, let's call it the sales and operations execution part of it, putting the controls in place. We were planning at car level, and without any of the features or take rates built into the modeling. So I know in the plenary session yesterday we gave an example of the harnesses where 56 harnesses on a model where you're making 10 cars a day, or 30 or 40 a week, you can very easily get that wrong. So we first built up the controls in terms of planning at car and feature level, sticking to sequence, that then stabilized production. And this year, with the new CEO being in place, we've actually put in the end-to-end supply chain process. Monthly cycle starts with a demand meeting with sales and ends with the combined S&OP group, which is supply chain, sales and finance, making the proposal for the next 18-month rolling forecast. So it's in its early days, but that's built up on data, transparent information on stock levels in the market, retail trajectory trends. So it's gone from being, I'd say, a production-based focus to an end-to-end process. So data's the key to it, and transparency.
So please do send your questions into Martin. But I think we have him back now. Hi, Martin. Can you hear us?
Hi, I can, yes. I think it's when the video clips go in and out, there's a bit of a technical buffering problem.
Yeah, no problem. Well, you saw yourself there front and center, kind of talking about, that cross-functional decision-making and how it's really, really important to, have that supply chain team firmly at the table. And I just kind of want to kick us off our discussion and ask, now that you've really lived through 2025, there's been so much happening this year, not in just the kind of finished vehicle side that I just kind of gave there, but what does your story at 2025 for 2025 look like for your supply chain now, kind of 9 months on from your red sofa?
Yeah, well, partly 9 months on is quite incredible. It feels like a lifetime ago, and yesterday at the same time. Who would have known that when we thought we were going to have a nice stable planning process, things like the tariffs would kick in, the Chinese market would continue to be very difficult, I would say, particularly for the ultra-luxury brands. And from a planning perspective, having watched that, whilst we have been running the S&OP process, I think the volatility in our business planning has been very high. Allied with, we've had a very exciting but challenging launch of the supercar Valhalla at the end of the year, which it might be relatively small in volume, but very high in complexity. So in a way, it's I think it's been another very difficult year. At the same time, I guess the backdrop is the first tier supply base in automotive continues to be in a difficult situation. I think many tier ones or tier N suppliers have a lot of financial challenges. So I think navigating those issues and the volatility related to that has also been quite tricky. Going back to the S&OP process, one of the good things I would say that's come from it is we're flowing now next year's business plan plus a look onto an 18-month horizon means I think we've got the most joined up forward plan that we've had with, let's face it, S&OP is 4 or 5 key elements, isn't it? It's retail sales, dealer stock levels, wholesale, company stock levels, and production, ultimately, with are you capacitized in the supply base in your factories to do it? I think for the first time, we've got a very joined up plan that's a forward plan that is on a rolling basis. And I think that's a massive step forward. And we're joining the dots between the fiscal years in a way that gives, hopefully, our supply base something that's realistic to work to, and also a more realistic curve from a volume perspective. So, yeah, it's been a tough year, actually. That we were hoping for a smoother year, but of course, the external world, you can't control that.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I guess one of the positives of that, though, is you do have that 18-month plan, forward plan come out from this. And actually talking to quite a lot of kind of the supply chain experts on site at our events previously, especially we just came back from an event in Mexico in November, is that, you know, while all this volatility has been going on, you're really having to forward plan in the moment, in real time. So it's kind of, someone said to me that, you know, we're actually revisiting things that you really want to have a look at, because it is the urgent things. So even though it's been a challenging year, hopefully there are still positives out of it, of, you know, how do we forward plan and how do we forward plan better? But I want to get your take a little bit on definitely on how you're continuing to use that supply chain management function within Aston Martin to really help orchestrate that decision making at Aston Martin, because I know that's a really big kind of direction for you going forward.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I think, you know, it's a passion of mine, but it's hard work, because we're still working on rudimentary tools and processes. I think, like I said in that Red Sofa interview, facts and data is fundamentally my philosophy. And I think from the orchestration perspective, we've been focusing on the basics of better forecasts, managing and controlling the plans and the capacities with the suppliers, but taking it to the next level. I think the volatility, again, has curveballed us. We've had to make, this is in the public domain because we've released our quarterly results, another 2 or 3 big adjustments to our plan. So the issue with that is you end up spending a lot of time recutting the plan and working on the finances rather than working on the business improvement activities. But from an orchestration perspective, I would say the critical thing we need to focus on next is the order to delivery visibility and that full end-to-end view of what is our customer promise, how do we optimize cash and profit versus demand. And what that means is, to all of our markets, understanding the lead times, understanding the customer promise. And we're building that up again from scratch almost. We're doing a value stream mapping of all of the flows. And I'm sure for people who work in some of the bigger OEMs who've got all this systemized already, it sounds a bit basic. But the important thing is, if we really want to manage our supply base from demanding parts from the suppliers to delivering cars to the customer with a certain customer promise, that end-to-end understanding of the lead times from start to finish is really important. And that in the end will help steer some of the other things like long-term supplier footprint, managing the end-to-end landed costs, so that being a big part of our sourcing strategy, so that the supply chain is geared towards our business, geared towards our volumes, and geared towards our customer promise.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, I know you said that kind of the formal S&OP process, you're still very much working on it, but it is there to break down some of those silos. Is there an example from this year where you thought, you know, this could have really been more of a crisis year? I have to emphasize the more, because everyone's been going through that crisis, but you've really handled that very much more smoothly than you anticipated, just because you were able to demonstrate that new resilience through gaining visibility from S&OP.
In very rudimentary terms, Emily, the fact that we're sitting together and staring at the pipeline end-to-end of the vehicles and dealer stock levels and what I call DS2, which is probably from my old Nissan days, of how many days of stock you've got in the dealers by model, by market versus the Ford retail plan. The fact that we're looking at all these things in advance means, at least with the CEO, the CFO, the COO, and the sort of leaders like myself in finance, sales, and supply chain and operations, at least we're staring at that now on a regular basis, and we are projecting scenarios and creating decisions that are based on facts and data. And I think it really is as simple as that for Aston, that without that, I think we would have reacted later and potentially had to have made a bigger adjustment to our plans and our volumes than we've done. So we've made some significant changes, but I think in previous years, it would have been probably a few months down the line before we would have reacted. And by that point, the network really would have been in a challenging state if we'd continued to build cars and not reacted to that. Let's say the adjustment to the sales in the US, or even the fact that when all the tariff announcements happened, we reacted fast. We put in a bonded warehouse. We stopped shipping cars to the US until we got more clarity on what the rules were going to be. We looked at price elasticity and how much it would change the volumes. And we were doing it as a collective cross-functional discussion with the CEO in real time. So that's been the big step forward for us. And maybe in a way, being a smaller company in automotive OEM context, we don't need the big global processes and tools because we can just get around a table. So don't get me wrong. I think if we can get the digital tools and the AI agents in place in the future, we'll be able to do real-time scenario planning, and that'll be even better. But at least it's got us around the table, and we've got a platform of data that's made us more proactive.
Yeah, perfect. Well, I actually wanted to touch on a little bit more widely on, you mentioned there on using AI for scenario planning and predictive analytics, perhaps. But what is kind of like now your roadmap? There's been so much change from when you initially shared to us 9 months ago. Of you mentioned maybe exploring ideas like a digital control tower and having closer partnerships with logistics providers to help those smaller flows. Because you've been very transparent about some of those really unique logistics realities for you, being a low volume and high value manufacturer, and what that means for your supply chain. So what does that kind of roadmap now look like for your digital transformation 9 months on from when you shared with us on the red sofa?
Yeah, good question. I think there's one area we've made great progress on, and there's another area I would love to make progress on, and we've got to convince the business to go for it. But the one we have made progress on is actually let's call it an LLP solution. So we actually have a long-term third-party logistics provider who basically has a contract that is from the part supplier to our line side. So it's an end-to-end 3PL, borderline 4PL contract in logistics terms. And they're our exclusive partner. And they've set up a management business model, which ultimately we have specific people doing all of our transport planning. But this company, I suppose I can mention it because it's in the public domain, it's DHL. DHL actually have an LLP solution which utilizes excuse me, I had a cold when I was on the red sofa, and I've got one now, so that's a nice coincidence.
It's obviously a trend. We're talking about trends.
Yeah, so yeah, it must be, exactly. Spring and autumn. No, so we've had a bespoke management team running the Aston Martin contract, and actually DHL have a digital LLP solution, which obviously maximizes their full collection network and allows them to do real-time transport planning with our live demand and optimize combinations of flows and groupage of deliveries and collections. And if you think about Aston, excuse me, I'll take a sip of water.
Yeah, do, please.
We almost have a very inverse or flipped business model compared to high volume OEMs that I've worked for previously. We have something like 650 collection points for inbound logistics. Only 22 of them warrant what we would call an FTL or a full truckload style flow. So a point-to-point flow in terms of volume. All the rest, our volume is so small, and most of it's in you could argue standard packaging, that it's being grouped with other carriers anyway. But actually, this is something where this LLP solution with DHL that should continue for the rest of our contract with them, that will do that real-time planning and really pick up those 1-2 boxes a week that we need of something and layer it in with much better planning with collected loads where we can get a better rate. So that's one thing that's happening, which probably long overdue. And you could argue, if we've had a long-term contract with DHL, why didn't we do it sooner? But different.
I think that's the story of this year. Why didn't we do a lot of things sooner? So that what comes with what I said before. Some of the positives is that some people have been saying that we have been planning.
Totally, Emily. And now I'm a big believer that I think for the big OEMs, and I'm not telling them how to do their business, but they have the scale and the control to, I think, have that in-house control tower network design tool, and then work in partnership with different transport providers to optimize. Let's say if we go in Europe, an Iberian cluster of collections, or in America, it could be, I guess, be a Central American cluster, whatever it is. For us, it makes sense. We've got an exclusivity agreement with DHL. Us investing in it when they have the capability and something off the shelf at the moment doesn't make sense. But I'm a big believer that logistics network design solution, real-time data, real-time tracking of goods and flows, optimizing costs is a must. So that's something I think is a given. And I think a lot of the other OEMs, when I've attended the Automotive Logistics conferences, are quite well on the way with versions of this solution, which is really good to see. Then the second digital tool that I'm desperate to get, but we need to really win the hearts and minds in the business to spend the money on it. And I think the business case pays for itself very fast, is let's call it integrated business planning solution. So that sort of planning tool where it maps out your demand into a production plan, into a distribution plan. And, there's different layers of granularity you can put into that. So it can help do the day job more efficiently. But more importantly, I think it can help do business planning and actually calculate revenue, cash flows, and profit. So I think that the plan we need to do is really persuade the CFO that the payback on this is very fast, and the amount of cost you would pay for the license is probably 4 or 5 cars in the wrong place at the end of the year that we've ended up building as a stock car that you have to incentivize. And I think if we can look at it in that context and create a really powerful business case, that's something that, again, would transform the business and would be something that the S&OP process would sit inside as well as a planning solution.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, that's a very good wrap up of some of kind of the digital aspects of where we can definitely pivot as an industry going into 2026 as well as just kind of looking at it as the lessons learned. But I also want to touch on an aspect. It's not a headline topic of the live stream agenda, but resilience, adaptability, and navigating uncertainty ultimately comes down to the people as well, and having a strong team. I know when we spoke in March at our event in Europe in Bonn, you were talking about the talent, the skill, and the training, and how important that is. So kind of with that in mind, what have you learned about, kind of leading teams through such an intense pressure and continuous change this year?
It's a fantastic question. And I would say working in a smaller OEM, it's much harder to be a good leader. And I'll qualify what I mean by that. I think you have to spend far more of your time with your sleeves rolled up, doing the job and helping to do the job and running the business than you do when if I compare this to when I was working in Volvo Cars, I was like a corporate leader, a corporate vice president, and I had a lot of team and structure and resource at my disposal. So in a way, you have to try even harder to spend time to help develop the team. Mm-hmm. But in the way you're sort of up to your eyes in the problem with them and living and breathing it with them. And I think it's far more coaching and mentoring and living the day job with the team and bringing them with you. And I think that's more important. And then I reflect on, okay, you can set a strategic direction, but in a way you have to be more able to work in ambiguity and volatility, because again, in a smaller OEM, that ability to move with the challenges and then sometimes change your priorities, is much more important, because you're not able to have the structures to carry on the same path. And the structures and the resources in a big OEM mean that when the crises hit, there's almost a structure there ready to deal with it. And I'm not saying it's not difficult, whereas here, it's then, okay, which plate do I keep spinning at what pace? Or sometimes which plate do we allow to drop? So when it comes to the people, I think even the people in our team are working in a much more fluid way of learning the job and actually being very, I'd say, resilient themselves to actually move from task to task and change their own priorities and touch lots of things. So I suppose my last point on that in terms of leadership, in the previous organizations I've worked for, you'd have a nice career path of people, move them around all the different areas of supply chain. They can work in inbound logistics, outbound logistics, planning, aftermarket, you name it. And once they've done all of that over a period of time, they've got a nice rounded profile in end-to-end supply chain. But here, I think we're often using our people in a very proactive way on a constant basis. And somebody might be doing one type of role one week, and then we pull them to do something else the next week because there's quite an urgent task. So yeah, it's a different style of leadership. And I think making people, but the fundamentals are the same. I think making your team know that they are in a place of psychological safety. Everybody makes mistakes, but ultimately we're all pulling in the same direction. We succeed together, we fail together. And as long as everybody's acting with integrity and the best intentions with the tools at their disposal, then we succeed and fail together, and nobody's going to be thrown under a bus or blamed for that. So it's really a very different style of leadership to being the corporate leader of a big supply chain function in one of the big OEMs.
No, but I appreciate the transparency on that. And I think it's a really nice sentiment to also share with the industry, that when you're going through so much change, that it's okay to fail and learn from it, because that's definitely what this year has been. So Martin, I want to keep you with us. I can definitely speak to you forever. But I will bring you back when we have Chris as well, because I know that we can have more of a discussion there. And we've had some questions come in from the audience. So for those who, didn't have, that we didn't get the chance to share them with Martin, we will make sure that they are shared directly with him, and also hopefully touch upon them in the segment with Chris, or in our upcoming content, in articles or future events, because we will have Martin with us in person, I'm glad to say, at our Automotive Logistics and Supply Chain Conference in Europe, in Bonn, which is in March again. And so please do make sure that you catch him there if you're going to be with us and hear more about Aston Martin's ongoing transformation. And we hope to see you there and continue this discussion as well, Martin. But we'll bring you back when Chris is coming on in about 10 minutes. But thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Emily.
Thank you. But I want to kind of carry on that narrative. Martin really touched on his digital transformation journey very briefly there. We could definitely go a lot more into it, but it sets us up perfectly for our next theme. If 2025 has taught us anything, as Martin said there, it's really about the real-time data, the advanced planning systems, and the AI-driven analytics that is really moving the needle in supply chain planning and strategy, and supply chain management as an influencing function. And as I noted earlier, companies are dealing with a tsunami of regulations and sustainability, trade compliance, and a lot of other areas. So new rules are cascading through supply chains, requiring visibility all the way down to tier end suppliers, as also Martin noted. But during our digital strategies event in North America this year, Ford's supply chain compliance lead actually noted that companies will need much more secure data exchange and to truly have a visible end-to-end supply chain to meet some of these future mandates and challenges coming up this year. So on top of that, there's definitely a push for supply chain teams to be resilient and efficient and to optimize inventory, transport, and costs, even while building those buffers and flexibility into the supply chain. So another trend in 2025 was definitely a notable shift towards AI moving into more practical pilot projects, with a big emphasis on cutting through the hype in these real applications. So we had John Rich with us, who is the lead logistics innovation. He was leading logistics innovation at Mazda, and he said at the conference, as he was also alongside Ford, and said, we should stop using AI and start using IA, the intelligent automation. His point there was really to, stop chasing that sci-fi vision of AI and have companies like pinpointing those manual processes and automate them intelligently to really move the needle when it comes to digitalization. And indeed, we heard many examples of exactly that at the conference, using algorithms to automate routine tasks like freight booking, document processing, and routing decisions. And in fact, at our Europe 2025 conference in Bonn, a panel on digital strategies for agile and competitive supply chains actually discussed the focus of how digitalization is evolving and what that means for pure cost cutting and to balance cost, resilience, and even sustainability in service, and why that really complex optimization really does require a lot of digital tools. And here's just a quick snapshot of that session where Gisela Linge, the Vice President of Global Logistics at Autoliv, gives a keynote and paints that vivid picture of a day-to-day life scenario of a future supply chain manager equipped with the right tools and using AI effectively. So we'll just look at that now. Thank you.
How would then a day in the near future look like, which is supported by AI, machine learning, and digital tools? I would start my day also with a strong coffee, and probably, as it would be in the near future, would ask my chatbot Chris, who is sitting on our digital supply chain twin or control tower or however you want to name it, and want to get an update how, for example, the latest tariff changes that came overnight would impact my supply chain, would impact my customers, the duty impact, which maybe also link it to, for example, information we have in the systems on financially risky suppliers. And based off the income terms, would they be able to handle another 25% on top of the cost they already have? So Chris, my supply chain bot, would help me in getting more insights, in visualizing these, and preparing me, for example, for an upcoming executive briefing. But it would also prompt me to ask me more questions and challenge myself, like what else should I think about, should I keep in mind? But there would not only be Chris, there would also be more. There would be maybe also a set of so-called AI agents in the S&OP area. So there you would have maybe Dana as an AI agent on the whole topic of demand planning, providing the scenarios here together with the bots out of the sales team, the agents. We would have maybe Connor on the supply and capacity side. And these AI agents would, so to say, more or less independently work together and provide me then the scenarios and the decision-making proposals for an S&OP upcoming meeting I would have later that day.
Perfect. So now something like that is still very much in its early stages, but we can see how the pieces are coming together across the industry. Companies are piloting AI-driven scenario planning tools. Some OEMs and tier one suppliers are using digital twins for in their production and logistics networks to really run those what if simulations, like what if a port closed for 2 weeks and how would I reroute? So throughout the year, we've also heard about more simpler use cases of AI, like a chatbot that answers internal questions and standard logistic processes, and even helps suppliers with packaging queries. And those are pretty narrow use cases, but it does show that these technologies are already finding their way into the data operations. But I do want to point out that, digitalization is not just all about AI. It is really to, improve those digital tools are really to improve the everyday efficiency. I mean, many companies have talked about using data analytics to optimize transport routes, warehouse layouts, and inventory levels. And for example, at one of our events, we heard about a group of OEMs and suppliers that formed Container Exchange, which is a data consortium to share logistics information securely and eliminate waste. In another example, Ford and its tier 1 supplier Flex built a system to exchange detailed carbon emission data for part deliveries. And, that might sound a bit niche, but it definitely saved them a huge amount of time in reporting and to help standardize how to measure, carbon in the supply chain. But while we're talking about digitalization, I just want to also give a quick note on that our Automotive Logistics and Supply Chain Digital Strategies North America Conference will be returning in June in Nashville in 2026. And we'll be diving deeper into all of the use cases that we shared here around AI, machine learning, and more around about how to use those digital toolings for connectivity in the supply chain. But that brings us swiftly into our final theme around the EV transition. We've been talking about, electric vehicles for years, but 2025 was really the year where we saw EVs really surge. In the US alone, General Motors had more than doubled its EV output compared to the years before. And in Europe and China, EVs are now reaching a significant share of total vehicle production. But this EV boom has come with a lot of logistics challenges. Transporting EV batteries is definitely tricky. The charging infrastructure for carriers is still lacking, and the weight and dimensions of EVs often force companies to reduce load factors, fewer vehicles per truck or ship, and adjusting routes to avoid weight limits, which can mean really kind of costly impacts and definitely low efficiency. And it's not just outbound logistics. On the inbound logistics side, the EV production has its own headaches, moving lithium-ion batteries from gigafactories to assembly plants, often across continents under strict safety regulations. So this year, we saw OEMs using more ocean and rail transport for batteries, developing special packaging solutions and training staff in hazmat handling. Some even localized battery pack assemblies closer to their vehicle plants to avoid that shipping high voltage packs over those long distances. But while there are challenges, the EV transition definitely did spark a lot of logistics innovation. Some companies are establishing brand new processes and facilities tailored to EVs. One particularly interesting concept is the EV Fulfillment Center from GM. And Marcio Lucon, GM's Executive Director of Global Logistics and Containers, really introduced this idea to us in an interview we did in August and later on at an event in Detroit. So I want to jump in straight and look at Marcio's Red Sofa with us, where he really kind of tears up where the company is with their EV transition.
What are some of the ways that you're working in vehicle logistics within the network and with your partners to manage those value fluctuations?
So EV, there's a lot of things that are similar and a lot of things that require a different approach. And I would say on the inbound, there is all the battery transportation requires completely different way that when you move an exhaust. I think this we have a pretty good setup in GM. It's all local, all US with high technology. And that we need to manage just the volume goes up or goes down, the volatility. When you go to the finished vehicles, there is, again, similar things, but two main issues that we see differently than other ICE vehicles. One is heavy. EV vehicles are more heavy, so the loading factor is different. So we need to plan in a different way how we do the loading planning for this distribution. Second, there are more uncertainty in the market. So for example, when you're gonna play with full-size trucks on the ICE vehicles, we know the business, we know the dealers, we know the colors, we play really well, we make a plan and this works perfectly. In EV, if we do the same, we're gonna move all the risk to the dealers, there's kind of uncertainty and volatility in the final customers. So we developed what we call EV fulfillment centers, which are special places that we keep the EVs, and the dealers can pull from there. So they have availability, they can quickly react, because a EV customer, if they lose the window, you basically lose the sale. And at the same time, they don't carry all the instability of the market. This is an initial stage that's very aligned with the commercial operation, and now you are optimizing this group and try to move them inside our VDC in a way that we have EV-specific requirements inside our old VDC operations. And so this is working really well. And I would say GM is performing really strong. We believe on EV, that's our future strategy. And we have a very strong portfolio, either for ICE or for EV. The customer can pick what they want, and you're going to be the right products. And we have been performing almost double than last year. So we are very strong second play in the market and moving in the right direction. And we'll never be able to do that without the right logistics, either inbound or outbound.
So I'm now very pleased to bring on a very familiar face from the Automotive Logistics team, Christopher Ludwig, our Chief Content Officer. Chris, welcome. It wouldn't be a live stream or an event or anything Automotive Logistics if we didn't have you with us. So I'm glad to have you here.
No, it's very good. It's very good to be here, and obviously excellent to see you hosting and sharing all this insight with our audience. So it's a pleasure. It's also good to see the different faces I wore this year. So from beard to no beard, maybe coming back a bit now. That's the big news.
I know. We got a lot of comments on the beard.
Yeah,
it's funny. Another trend of 2025, Chris's beard. But I want to kind of go back and loop onto some of the things that Marcio shared there. He really talked in that clip about the EV transition, but he really did also in his wider, interview with us back in August and also on the Red Sofa. He did echo some of the things that Martin was also mentioning around, supply chain taking more of a strategic role within the business. So I want to get your thoughts a little bit on, how you see that fitting into kind of the year's story this year, and where you think this trend will continue to go forward.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I think what Marcio Luson's one of his main points in coming into the role at GM was to kind of raise the influence that logistics has in strategic decisions. As he always said, having a seat at the table, being in the room where decisions are being made. Clearly, as we talked about earlier with Martin, I'm sure we can touch on again, that supply chain and logistics can be that orchestrator of information. It's almost like a neutral view that brings together information from across the supply chain and helps to make the best possible decision, not just on cost. Obviously, sometimes it could be a total cost picture, and often is. But if you just look at cost alone, you might be missing the inventory picture, the time to market, the financing aspects that come into it, the trim levels, a whole host of things. So I think you need a party that can bring that together. And as you alluded to earlier, where the data can be centralized with the tools that can help scenario plan that, which can help us better understand that, are important. I think what's also interesting, or probably important to note, if we're putting that then in the context of the EV transition, and there, like so much in the supply chain, I think Martin said it earlier, right? Having to succeed in ambiguity and volatility. I think nothing captures that better than the EV transition right now. General Motors, as you mentioned, or as Marcio mentioned, big growth in EV this year, maybe up until half-year point or even up into the third quarter. But of course, General Motors, like many in the industry, knew that a change was coming because the regulation was changing in the US with an incentive going out. So there was perhaps a pull forward in demand, which now will shift Doesn't mean that demand goes away, but it shifts. The supply chain and logistics needs to be able to respond to, let's call them inorganic demand signals or changing demand signals. Regulation driving it up, then pulling it down. And how do you avoid a big bottleneck or bullwhip in the supply chain, which could result in overcapacity, undercapacity? So this is such a big story in the whole EV transition, and I think it relates very well to how the role that logistics and supply chain plays in managing through this volatility. Can't see the future always, but can see a demand signal, can scenario plan, and be ready to help manage that.
Yeah, no, thank you. We didn't manage to see, a news Red Sofa in full there, but I know there was a part 1 and a part 2, and you interviewed him at both FBL and on site at Global. And I just want to touch on, like, he was talking about the reality that these things don't shift over, that localization element doesn't shift overnight. And, some are kind of responding to the tariffs with localization. But we also heard GM at one of our events talking about, industrializing North America with a more regional supplier footprint. So kind of, in your view, how do you see 2025 moving closer to that true local for local production and sourcing, and kind of maybe giving a bit of an overview as well, but kind of what Anu was referring to as well.
So how many more hours do we have?
We can have this as a whole segment.
Yeah, of course we can. No, but it's such an important point. And I guess to try and cut through on one level, and something Anu was saying, and I know it got a bit cut off, but one of his key messages, both on the service parts, but also on the vehicle logistics side, is, the decision was made, Volkswagen made the decision, many made the decision, if you look in the US, to keep shipping and to keep providing service or vehicles, even though the tariff costs went up. And then initially in April, based on like on off again, there was maybe a hope that maybe it would change, and so maybe we hold back. But ultimately, the decision was, no, if we don't continue to produce and move, we'll lose market share. So that was the strategic decision, exactly for the reasons that you said. You can't pivot, you can't localize overnight. The quickest you can maybe do is move a vehicle which is produced in 2 locations, like we see with Nissan, produce Rogue in Japan and in the US. Now it's increasing the US production, but even that is maybe 6 months to a year to make that shift, because you have tooling capacity, you have volume plants, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't do it overnight. But going back to our earlier point on orchestration, the decision of, it's in the company's interest, based on the goals we align on, to pay this extra cost right now in tariffs right now. But over time, you will see that industrial footprint start to shift. And GM is a good example. If this is public, $4 billion invested in the US. We're starting to see some models which shift, from different locations. And there, the full picture of that is not fully revealed. Just this past week, they've announced additional investment in some component plants and tooling plants, because that has to happen bit by bit. If you just move the vehicle without starting to move your tooling and components, then you're also, you have a longer supply chain and perhaps disjointed. And of course, there are potential tariffs on that side too, but it wouldn't fit the local for local. So again, to avoid going on for hours and hours, like I said, I think—
Don't worry, part 2 coming in January.
Part 2 coming in January, so we'll save some of that. But as said, I think strategic decision to pay literally billions, as we see, in extra tariff costs to maintain a market share and start to position the supply chain. And logistics, of course, has to support that decision and be ready to adapt in between. And what becomes really critical is having the right information in the right place to at least mitigate where you can, right? What can you mitigate? What can you offset? Make sure USMCA compliance, etc. So again, a lot more detail on that, but I think that's a little bit of a snapshot.
For sure. A lot more detail on that to come. It will all be on Automotive Logistics on the website, and our events and our conferences, for sure. But before I touch on some of the digitalization aspects that we've been talking around control towers, data hubs, AI, especially around some of the things that Martin touched on, we have some questions coming in from the audience, and I think it'll be a good one to kind of understand how much progress has been made on kind of the battery passport front, and will digital twins be a key aspect in that implementation in your view?
Yeah, the battery passport, we can look into that more. I think on the one hand, what I see is this is related to a push across the industry to map the supply chain more. Now, there are different examples of maybe in this case using, I think Volvo has tried to use blockchain to validate across the battery passport side. Container X, as you mentioned earlier, Container X has a use case for battery passport, which is being used. I don't think we see it in its full implementation yet. But if I can transition it a little bit more, is an absolutely key strategic message, and we had this just last week in Munich at our Digital Strategies Conference, is having that tier N visibility. We see it from Nexperia, from that looming crisis, from critical minerals, from many things. The Novelis fire, the aluminium supplier fire, which has impact across the supply chain. That might not be in OEM's tier 1, or it might be a tier 2 or tier 3 in some cases. But if you don't see what where the supplies are coming from, you're at greater risk of disruption. That's one side. That's the sort of supply chain risk side. But on the battery passport and related, whether it's forced labor or other requirements that are coming in the EU and the US, we need to be able to show at the border or in import processes that certain vehicles or products don't contain certain materials that violate certain laws, human rights, etc. There's a whole host of these aspects, and likely to get more complex. EU deforestation rules delayed a few times, but battery passport, maybe the implementation gets delayed, but these things are coming. And the USMCA, for example, already has a high labor and rules of origin. In the new version negotiation, maybe this gets even more aggressive. How will OEMs, tier 1s, be able to show the origins of their parts, prove certification? This is a big driver of digitalization. I think you mentioned it, or there was an OEM who mentioned it earlier in the year. The single biggest driver of OEM of AI use in certain departments is absolutely compliance. And how do you actually certify and validate these things?
Yeah, for sure. That was Ford, really like re-emphasizing that the digital strategies in North America event. Well, that is a good segue into, because I did want to talk more about this wave of digitalization. You just mentioned that we've come back from an event last week in Europe, specifically focused on that and looking at increased visibility. Can you give a little bit more context of some of those kind of key takeaways from that, some of the biggest opportunities in digitalization right now?
Yeah, and again, I think what we've seen on the one hand, acceleration of use, obviously AI interest everywhere, Gen AI, agentic AI. But before I go into maybe some of the use cases, that I think the foundational work that needs to be done is becoming quite clear and pretty agreed across the industry. So whether you're, as Martin would have talked about, whether you're working with a 3PL, 4PL, and maybe have a partner which you're going to digitalize things, or you're doing more of this yourself, either way, the first and foremost thing is to have the data standardized across your supply chain, right? So do you actually have coherent semantic data, which is semantically comprehensible across different departments, between OEM, LSP, supplier? Is it Excel based, or is it EDI? I mean, the whole host of different ways. It doesn't really matter the single tool, but it needs to be in a data lake or in some way brought together. That's the first and foremost, because if you start running machine learning based on inaccurate data and then Gen AI, I mean, you just get, there's a 4-letter word we could use, in, out, and that's just called garbage in, garbage out. So that first and foremost has to happen, and we see that really happening. So examples of data lakes and of command centers or control towers, etc. So I think that's a kind of solid level to deal with the day-to-day, and then move to other examples. Again, I won't go too deep into all the examples I heard last week, but where we're really starting to see AI, particularly Gen AI and now autonomous agents, with use cases has been in things like documentation. So RFQs, customs, lots of procurement processes where you can maybe like chat with the variety of different offers there. And then BMW gave us a really good example, and there's a video we can of course share afterwards. And they're
definitely it's live now, on the Red Sofa
on the AL site, of using agentic AI to check inventory of tooling assets at different suppliers. And this is so far an agent which has been given delegated authority to basically complete a manual task. It's exactly that intelligent automation that you mentioned. It's a really interesting example, but the next step, and this is what Alda Vaganza, who leads supplier digitalization and procurement digitalization at BMW, said, the real win will be when an OEM's agents and a tier one's agents and a logistics provider agents can communicate with one another and talk about and sort of execute key tasks. It's not there yet. Maybe it needs a container X to get there, or different data standards. Maybe it's others. But I think that's sort of the roadmap that we're starting to see emerge. If I were to, again, maybe just point to highlight around that.
Yeah, perfect. I wanted to bring back Martin onto the screen, but we are running to time. So I'm just going to stick with Chris. And I know there have been questions here directly for Martin. So Martin, if you're still with us on the back end, we will get them to you. And it's definitely been a pleasure to have you with us. And it was great to hear your insights 9 months on from the red sofa. And we will definitely see you again in Bonn. But Chris, to kind of sign us off, I mentioned at the beginning, we have core themes on that we follow on automotive logistics, and just 3 of those are around regionalization, digitalization, and electrification. But a theme for me, and I know for you through our conversations, is that supply chain leaders' role in the industry is becoming more pivotal than ever. So how do you see kind of supply chain leaders going into 2026? Kind of what is your advice for them to wrap us up on some of this? It's a big question to end on. So
yeah, well, that definitely feels like one where it's good to have at least Martin watching and with us, because this is something he and I actually talk about a lot in terms of, again, that role and function that the supply chain leaders, call it chief supply chain officers, whatever you want to call the role, should play. And it goes back again to that sort of orchestration, bringing that data points together, helping to make the right decision. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they make the decisions, because it's sort of down to a strong aligned S&OP process to bring the right decision makers and choose the priorities. So it's not necessarily a supply chain chooses, but supply chain puts the best possible scenarios on the table. And when we think about 2026, I don't know what to predict, but I can be sure you expect the unexpected and be ready for the unexpected. So your scenario planning needs to be aligned to the fact that we might see another evolution in the tariff situation. We'll likely see some shift in EV policy incentives one way or another. Don't expect the geopolitical tensions between the US, China, others to just dissipate, right? And what direction they're going to take, we don't know, but we need to be ready for that. And what suppliers will catch fire, unfortunately, over the next year.
A few of those have happened, unfortunately.
We need to be ready for it. But I think and maybe just the last point, one point that I think has been so important across many of our events and our discussions. There are very few parts of the world right now where you can rely on unabated absolute growth expectation. There's very few markets that are going just like this. Not the US, not Europe, not China. Markets are either going like this or more likely going like this. And anyone who wants to succeed or needs to succeed in the supply chain or logistics right now needs to know how to add value, not just when you're rising, but when you're going up and down and up and down. And that comes down to many of the tools we've been talking about. It comes down to the resiliency. It comes down to the people. Maybe we haven't spoken enough about that in this live stream. And certainly if any transition, digitalization to a strong supply chain organization, it comes down to the skills, talent, mindset of the people working in those organizations, and they need to be able to add value exactly in that disruption. So that's sort of I think a positive note, even though it's a realistic note perhaps, but an absolute important note for us to kind of end on here and think about the road ahead.
No, definitely. You're very aligned with Martin. He also ended on the people front. So it's great that we're aligned with the real experts out there. So, but Martin, I'm sorry we didn't bring you back. We'll definitely make sure that those questions are sent to you. We'll continue having those conversations. You'll be with us in Bonn. And thank you, Chris, for doing a live wrap up with us here on our very last live stream of the year. But before we sign off, just a quick announcement and maybe a few acknowledgements that even though this is our final live stream of 2025, we will be back in 2026 in January with a whole new series of live events, bringing you more exclusive insights from across the automotive supply chain. In fact, we mentioned it here. We'll be doing a part 2. So January we'll be looking more on the forward-looking predictions, keeping an eye out across all of what we'll be writing about in the lead up to that on Automotive Logistics, and then also join us live or kind of on demand after. We have some great content lined up for us next year. And also to stay informed, be sure to also check out our 2026 media pack and editorial calendar. Those are live, and whichever medium you prefer, whether that's online articles, magazines, live stream, video articles, live exclusive wrap-ups here with myself and Chris. We will have that for you, and make sure that we keep delivering that core content for you that offers you value in times of a lot of change and uncertainty. But with that, I just want to say one last thank you to Marta Corner for joining us live, and to our contributors as well, Anu Goal, Peter Hernleim, Marcio Lucon, and of course to our very own Christopher Ludwig for sharing his experiences and their experiences live with us today. And despite the challenges of 2025 that was really thrown at us this year, the automotive logistics community has definitely shown incredible resilience, creativity, and collaboration. The story of 2025 is ultimately one that definitely looks at adapting and overcoming, and I believe that puts us on a stronger footing for 2026 and beyond. On behalf of the entire Automotive Logistics team, I wish you a very wonderful holiday season and a very happy new year ahead. We look forward to seeing you online and in person at our events in 2026. But until next time, thank you and goodbye.